A stable, unified Syria at peace with itself and its neighbors will also enhance peace and security for those in the region and beyond. We look forward to further supporting Syria's counterterrorism efforts by building on its membership in the global coalition to defeat ISIS. The United States also applauds Iraq and Syria's July 17th announcement to advance rehabilitation of the Iraq-Syria crude oil pipeline, restoring a critical energy corridor which will make energy more accessible to the global market. We welcome the engagement of a U.S.-led consortium on this project, which advances security and stability through prosperity for both countries. This progress reflects the vision and leadership of President Trump to build a more prosperous and interconnected region.
These military actions by the IDF, together with the continued occupation of Syrian territory, are a clear violation of international law and the sovereignty of the Syrian Arab Republic, and they undermine efforts to fully resolve the situation in the country. We call on West Jerusalem to stop these military escapades. We remind the Israeli government of the need to fully and unconditionally implement the disengagement of forces agreement of 1974.
And here, the Lebanese judicial authorities, and we thank them for this, have handed over a former officer wanted by the Syrian authorities, wanted on charges of murder and torture. And from this platform in Security Council, we renew our call to all countries to cooperate with Syria in pursuing fugitives and supporting the course of transitional justice.
10,215 meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Qatar, the Syrian Arab Republic, and Turkey to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting: Mr. Claudio Cordone, Deputy Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Syria; Mr. Indrika Wadwate, Acting Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator; and Ms. Rula Rukbi, Country Director of Women Now for Development, Lebanon. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Claudio Cordone.
Thank you, Madam President. And I'm briefing you from Damascus, following the Secretary General's visit to Syria last month, the first Vice Secretary General in 17 years. Let me, at the outset, thank the Syrian authorities for all the efforts made to ensure a secure and open environment for all his engagements. In his meetings with President al-Shara, Foreign Minister Shibani, and other senior officials, the Secretary General welcomed progress in Syria's political transition, including steps to strengthen state institutions and towards reconciliation, accountability, and transitional justice. He stressed that the success of the political transition will ultimately be measured by whether all Syrians feel represented in state institutions and able to participate meaningfully in shaping their country's future. He shared this message during his open engagements with a wide array of Syrian women, civil society, and diverse communities. The Secretary General was equally clear that Syria cannot meet the transition challenges alone. Greater international support is essential to meet urgent humanitarian recovery and development needs and create conditions for safe, dignified, and voluntary returns. Syrians need tangible improvements in their daily lives and a viable future in their country. international support is essential to the success of the political transition itself. Madam President, I welcome the US rescinding of Syria's designation as a state sponsor of terrorism. These steps should help create more favorable conditions for economic recovery, investment, and broader international engagement with Syria. According to an International Monetary Fund mission that visited Damascus last month, recovery is accelerating and double-digit growth in 2026 is projected. But widespread poverty and renewed inflation mean conditions remain very difficult for most Syrians. Madam President, the People's Assembly has adopted rules of procedures, and we await the beginning of its substantive work, including on a host of legislative priorities. Further clarity is needed on the Assembly's oversight role regarding the executive. Its independence and transparency will be important to the Assembly's credibility and to fostering public trust and international confidence in the transition. The process for drafting a permanent constitution is also yet to be specified. We encourage an inclusive, transparent, and participatory process capable of forging a new social contract for Syria. There is urgency in starting this process, as in preparing for the elections at the end of the transition, and my office stands ready to provide technical support and advice. Madam President, this month, the Damascus Fourth Criminal Court convicted and sentenced to death several former officials, including former President Bashar al-Assad, who along with others was tried in absentia, as well as Atif Najib and Wasim al-Assad, who appeared in person. Ahmed Hassoun, former Grand Mufti, was also tried in person and received a life sentence. The proceedings incorporated several important fair trial safeguards for the defendants present in court, and there is a right of appeal within 30 days. However, fair trial safeguards should be strengthened by reinforcing effective legal representation and ensuring a full appeal on the facts, not just on points of law. Greater consistency with fair trial standards will strengthen confidence in the fairness and integrity of the transitional justice process and ensure that guilt is assigned to individual perpetrators and not to groups. And consistent with UN policy, and as called for by the General Assembly, I urge the Syrian authorities to establish a moratorium on all executions. On 21st of August, I attended the commemoration of the chemical attack in eastern Ghouta and Ma'adamiyya, which killed some 1,500 and left thousands injured. I express my solidarity with the victims and survivors, my regret that the international community failed to prevent these atrocities, and underscore the need for full accountability for those responsible. Madam President, Israeli military activity has continued in southern Syria, including repeated ground incursions, house searches, and the destruction of private and agricultural property, particularly in Quneitra and the Yarmouk Basin. I note the release of a number of Syrians held in Israeli detention, but remain concerned by continuing detentions, and families are seeking information on the fate and whereabouts of their detained relatives. I'm also concerned by statements from senior Israeli officials advocating an open-ended Israeli military presence on Syrian territory. The continued Israeli presence east of the ceasefire line violates Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity and is inconsistent with the 1974 disengagement of forces agreement. Let me also reiterate, as the Secretary General did during his visit, that the Golan Heights remain occupied Syrian territory in accordance with international law and relevant Security Council and General Assembly resolutions. Another worrying development was the Israeli airstrike on the Abu Dhuhr airbase in northern Syria on 18th August, which I condemn. I welcome the recent direct Israel-Syria contacts and talks in Jordan and support the United States' efforts to mediate a security arrangement between Syria and Israel and the operation of the confliction mechanism. Diplomacy must prevail, and negotiation should progress within the framework of international law. Madam President, Syria continues to face significant internal security challenges. Although overall violence declined in August from July, violent criminal acts continue to be frequently reported, particularly killings perceived by local communities as retaliatory attacks against specific groups. Civil society organizations continue to report disappearances of women, men, and children. While some individuals have returned to their families, including an 8-year-old girl this month, others have been found dead, and many remain unaccounted for. Deaths in custody, possibly resulting from torture, have been reported. A commission of inquiry established by the Ministry of Interior found that Mohammed Meira died as a result of physical abuse inflicted during interrogation in custody. I condemn this and send my condolences to his family. I welcome the minister's commitment to hold accountable responsible personnel, while urging a clear and sustained public government position against any abuses in detention, as well as enhanced guidelines and training. Effective law enforcement will be essential to efforts to rebuild a society in which all citizens feel protected from violence and abuses. The Ministry of Interior's efforts to train women police officers represent a positive step, particularly in strengthening responses to crimes affecting women and girls. I also wish to stress that the threat posed by terrorism, specifically Daesh, remains a serious concern. Earlier this month, the Syrian authorities announced the arrest of a prominent Daesh commander as part of a continuing efforts to pursue Daesh leaders and networks and sustain counterterrorism efforts consistent with international law remain essential. Madam President, I welcome the important progress achieved in the 25 August meeting between President Ashara and Mazloum Abdi, marking continuing steps forward on security and administrative integration of northeastern Syria. And I particularly welcome the announcement of Mazloum Abdi at the end of the mission of the Syrian Democratic Forces and their dissolution. I know the importance of the issue of education and look forward to further progress on that issue. I also note that further discussions have taken place between the Ministry of Interior and the Women's Protection Units on that latter's integration. And I reiterate our support for the full implementation of the 29th January Agreement and the readiness of the United Nations to provide support on the ground. I note at the same time that the first convoy of returnees to Ras Al Ain was attacked on 10th August, triggering tensions that spread to Ain al-Arab Kobani, Hasaka, and elsewhere, underscoring the potential for localized tensions to challenge broader progress. Madam President, Sweden continues to be characterized by a political and security stalemate. Relations between local actors and the authorities in Damascus remain marked by mutual distrust, with some actors continuing to call for independence or joining Israel. Long-standing grievances remain unresolved, particularly those concerning accountability, although trials of some of the alleged perpetrators started in July. A concerning incident involving the desecration of Christian graves was reported in As-Sawar al-Kubra, an area under government control in northern countryside of Sweden, following earlier similar reports involving Druze graves. We take note of the presidential decree of 17 August, providing for an exceptional examination session for Swedish students who missed their examination last June. There are concerns about the location of the examination centers and about how many students would actually sit the examination. And there are reports indicating attempts from within Sweden to prevent students from traveling to sit for their examination. We remain ready to support the implementation of the September 2025 roadmap, including the returns of displaced Druze and Bedouin populations, and addressing the issues of detainees and the missing, while remaining guided by Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Madam President, ensuring the meaningful participation of all segments of society remains essential. In Damascus, Syrian women shared with the Secretary General their views on a broad set of issues, including the recognition of all victims as part of a transitional justice strategy, the importance of proper investigation of allegations of abductions and sexual assaults of Syrian women, and the importance of greater representation of women in decision-making positions, as well as their meaningful participation in the recovery and reconstruction efforts. And I'm pleased that the Council will have the opportunity to hear more on these issues from Rula Rukabi. Syrian women remain an extraordinary reservoir of experience and capacity. Their efforts to build a Syrian state that meets the expectation of Syrian women, and indeed all Syrians, predate this transition. For more than a decade, the Office of the Special Envoy has benefited from the Women's Advisory Board's invaluable contribution to mediation efforts. With the change of circumstances on the ground, we conducted an extensive consultation process to explore how best to continue this strong engagement with Syrian women. We will now expand our outreach to Syrian women, discuss themes of their choosing, and share their recommendations with the government. Although the board held its final meeting in July, its members will continue contributing to the transition. And I thank them for their commitment and advice, and the donors for their support over the years. Civil society organizations likewise emphasize inclusion and participation in their meeting with the Secretary General, welcoming progress while calling for judicial and security sector reform, accountability, an inclusive transitional justice process, equal rights, and the protection of civic space. And the discussions showcase the range and depth of civil society and the contributions they can make to Syria's successful transition. Madam President, before concluding, allow me to underline the continuing cooperation with the Syrian authorities. Together, we are collaborating on areas of mutual interest and doing so in close coordination with the UN country team. Our objective remains to develop further such cooperation through the presence of a restructured office in Damascus. And we will continue to build on this progress with the support of the Council, guided by our shared commitment to Syria's successful transition. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Mr. Cordone for his briefing, and I now give the floor to Mr. Enrique Ratuate.
Madam President, I thank Deputy Special Envoy Cordone for his continued efforts to advocate for and support for the people of Syria. Last week, I was in Syria and had the opportunity to travel to Deir ez-Zor, al-Raqqa, Aleppo, and Idlib, and met with communities, humanitarian partners, and the authorities. My central message is simple. Syria is at a pivotal moment, and Syrians are hopeful for a stable and prosperous future. After years of conflict, displacement, and economic decline, there are encouraging signs of revival. More Syrians are returning home. Agricultural production is improving, with reports suggesting that this year's wheat harvest could allow Syria to achieve seasonal self-sufficiency. Energy and transport networks are gradually recovering. Commercial activity is increasing, and humanitarian access remains broadly improved compared with previous years. These developments matter because they offer something Syrians have lacked for too long: hope that recovery is possible. The government remains steadfast in consolidating fragile stability into sustainable development and economic growth. The international community must seize this opportunity and support the aspirations of the Syrian people. But optimism must be tempered with realism. Humanitarian needs still remain immense. Millions of people still struggle to access healthcare, food, clean water, education, and livelihoods. And the gap between needs and available resources is growing. Syria is experiencing the largest voluntary return movement in the region in over a decade. Nearly 2 million internally displaced people and more than 1.7 million refugees have returned to their communities since December 2024. But return does not mean the end of humanitarian need. For many families, it is the beginning of another struggle in rebuilding their lives. Homes remain damaged or destroyed. Basic services are struggling to absorb rapidly growing populations. Schools, hospitals, water systems need rehabilitation. Access to livelihoods remain extremely limited. However, dealing with unexploded ordnance and mines as well as rubble removal continue to be a key enabler. At the same time, more than 5.5 million people remain internally displaced, including some 830,000 people living in more than 1,200 camps. The challenge is therefore to ensure that returns are safe, voluntary, and dignified, to enable sustainable reintegration in their areas of origin, and that people have what they need to stay. In this context, the government's No Tents, No Camps initiative reflects an important objective: moving families from prolonged displacement towards durable and sustainable solutions. Humanitarians stand ready to support these efforts, working in close collaboration with recovery and development actors, in coordination with the government. Madam President, as families return home and as communities begin to recover, another danger comes into sharper focus: explosive ordnance. Since December 2024, the grim reality is that close to 1,400 explosive ordnance incidents have caused more than 2,400 casualties, including 865 deaths and nearly 1,600 injuries. Sadly, 22 of those deaths and 47 of those injuries have taken place just since the 17th of July. Most incidents took place in agricultural and grazing areas. Farmers working their lands, shepherds moving livestock, children playing outdoors. These are everyday acts that carry deadly risks. My inaction in Syria is not optional. It's essential for safe returns, agricultural recovery, and economic revival. Progress is possible. In 2024, Mine Action partners surveyed 215 million square meters of land. And in 2025, that increased 18-fold to 4 billion square meters, roughly 5 times the size of New York City. While there are nearly 3 times as much as explosive ordnance have been identified and destroyed. But the scale of contamination remains immense. Expanded survey and clearance operations, risk education, and mine action support must keep pace and be scaled up. Madam President, the humanitarian community continues to deliver across Syria. In the first 6 months of this year, we and our humanitarian partners reached an average of 2.4 million people each month with food, clean water, life-saving medical procedures, and protection services. The Syria Humanitarian Fund has just launched a 70 million allocation to support safe and dignified returns, community integration, explosive hazard clearance, and rapid humanitarian response across the country. At the same time, a separate 5 million allocation will support partners delivering assistance to communities in dire need in southern Syria. Syrian organizations are at the heart of all humanitarian efforts, representing nearly 60% of the partners on the ground. But we are being asked to do more with less. This is not a realistic ask. Even after we prioritize the most severe needs and reduce funding requirements by 1/3, the Syria humanitarian appeal is only 30% funded at this point. This is precisely the moment when investment can turn fragile progress into lasting recovery. Such progress will reverberate in Syria, with significant positive implications for the region and beyond. Syria needs investments to realize its vision of transitioning out of humanitarian need into reconstruction and development. Funding the humanitarian response to mitigate acute vulnerabilities and systemic fragility fosters stability and enables recovery. These are investments in key sectors that lay the foundation for scalable, sustainable investments in rebuilding a nation. Syria is demonstrating that change and transformation is not just possible, it is attainable. Madam President, in conclusion, I have 3 asks. First, commit to sustained and flexible funding for humanitarian and development action. Invest in the future that the Syrian people aspire to. Secondly, invest in durable solutions for displaced people and returnees, alongside robust reconstruction and economic recovery efforts led by the Syrian government. Thirdly, prevent Syria from being drawn into regional conflict, which should bring more displacement, division, deprivation, and instability to people who have already endured far too much. Progress remains fragile, but it is real. Often in this Council, we have debated and discussed complex and intractable situations with no resolution in sight. The message I heard across Syria was clear. People want the opportunity to rebuild their lives. They would like to see the international community's support to fulfill this aspiration. This is not a moment to step back. It is a moment to invest in stability and progress. This is the moment to show our solidarity with the people of Syria and turn hope into recovery and prosperity. Madam President, it's a carpe diem moment, and the moment is now, and we should seize it. I thank you.
And I thank Mr. Watwate for his briefing. And I now give the floor to Ms. Rula Rukbi. تفضلي.
السيدة الرئيسة، أصحاب السعادة. شكرا.
Madam President, Excellencies, thank you for providing this space for a voice from Syrian feminist civil society. My name is Rula Rukbi, a daughter of the city of Hama, and I carry with me the memory of one of the largest mass atrocities committed by the former regime against Syrians. Government forces killed approximately 30,000 civilians in February 1982. I am here today as the country director of Women Now for Development Lebanon. For 14 years, our work has been guided by one central principle. Change must begin from the bottom and reach the top. After years of war, repression, displacement, and loss, many Syrians welcomed the fall of the Assad regime in December 2024 with joy and hope. Hope that it would bring an end not only to war, but also to authoritarianism, fear, and exclusion. Since power has changed hands in Syria, the most important question has been, what kind of state are we building after this change? Are we building a state in which every Syrian feels that they are equal citizens? Or are we recreating a similar system under a new name? We have serious concerns about excessive centralization, the absence of an effective separation of powers, and the lack of clarity around governance, transparency, and accountability, alongside the deteriorating economic situation. Syrians still do not clearly know how decisions are made, by whom, or how those decision makers can be held accountable. And this is where one of the greatest risks of the transition lies. That we change the people in power without changing the way power is exercised. A genuine transition means building a new relationship between the state and its citizens. One in which the rule of law applies to everyone and protects everyone equally. Madam President, Syrian women have paid an enormous price throughout the conflict. They have endured displacement, poverty, violence, detention, and disappearance, and continue to bear the brunt of the ongoing humanitarian crisis alongside entrenched legal and social discrimination. Despite this, Syrian women have played a leading role in documenting human rights violations, providing aid to their communities, and advocating for justice and accountability, including for missing persons. While at the international level, we see positive efforts by the Syrian transitional authorities to recognize the important role of women, for instance, in the context of the search for missing persons, women still find themselves at the margins when it comes to decisions about the country's future at home. For instance, women's representation in parliament is less than 11%. And only one member of the transitional cabinet is a woman. But this is not a matter of numbers. Meaningful participation means women being present when decisions are made, not only when photos are being taken. Women's rights and personal and civil liberties are not issues that can be deferred, including the reform of nationality and personal status laws, stronger protections against gender-based violence, and removing Syria's reservations to the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women. A state that does not recognize women as full and equal citizens cannot be democratic, regardless of what its political system is called. Reports of the abduction of women and girls since December 2024, particularly from the Alawite community, are deeply alarming. Targeting women because of their sectarian identity or using violence against them to take revenge or instill fear in their communities perpetuates precisely the patterns of violence that Syria must overcome. This brings me to transitional justice. Syria needs justice that does not select its victims. For decades, Syrians were subjected to violations, including arbitrary detention, torture, and enforced disappearance at the hands of the former regime. Civilians also suffered abuses at the hands of non-state armed groups and other actors. But violations did not end with the fall of the regime. Today, people continue to be arbitrarily detained for expressing opinions. We also hear troubling reports of torture and ill treatment in detention facilities, including, most recently, the death of a former White Helmet, Mohammed Gamira, following alleged torture while in detention. Violence on the Syrian coast and in Suwaida, involving security forces and local armed groups, has also led to serious violations, including killings of civilians and sexual and gender-based violence, some of which has taken on sectarian and retaliatory dimensions, targeting Alawite and Druze communities alongside a rise in hate speech targeting different Syrian communities. Victims of the former regime and different armed groups, and victims of violations committed since December 2024 have the same right to truth and justice. A victim is a victim, and a violation is a violation, regardless of who committed it. If the new Syria is built on making a distinction between victims who deserve justice and those who can be ignored, we will be planting the seeds of the next conflict. Genuine reconciliation must be built on truth, recognition, accountability, reparations, and guarantees of non-recurrence. Excellencies, rebuilding Syria is not only about rebuilding roads and homes. It is about rebuilding trust. Trust between citizens and the state, trust amongst Syrians themselves, and trust that the law exists to protect people, not to be used as a weapon against them. Return to Syria must also be voluntary, safe, dignified, and sustainable. It must be linked to social protection and reconstruction that serves people including by providing support for those who have lost their homes and developing cooperative and social housing, so that return does not simply mean moving from displacement into poverty and insecurity. The UN also bears a fundamental responsibility. We recognize the necessity of engaging constructively with the Syrian transitional authorities and working with them. However, international support for the political transition must be linked to clear benchmarks on human rights, the rule of law, and accountability. The desire for stability in Syria should not lead to the acceptance of shrinking civic space, restrictions on freedoms, or selective justice and accountability. We have learned at an enormous human cost that stability built on fear and silence is not peace. It merely defers the next crisis. Madam President, I conclude with 4 recommendations for the Security Council and the UN. First, human rights, including women's rights, must be at the center of the UN's evolving role in Syria. Human rights, civic space, women's full, equal, meaningful, and safe participation, accountability, and the rule of law must remain integral to the UN's political engagement with the Syrian transitional authorities and must be central to any new UN presence in Syria. Second, maintain strong and independent human rights scrutiny. Security Council members should continue to support independent UN human rights and accountability mechanisms and should encourage the Syrian transitional authorities to ensure full cooperation and effective access to these mechanisms. The UN should also continue to follow accountability processes concerning violations on the Syrian coast and in Sueda, while emphasizing transparency, compliance with international standards, and responsibility at all levels, including command responsibility. Third, help protect and expand Syria's civic space. The space that Syrians have today to organize, speak, and engage publicly remains fragile. The UN should continue to monitor restrictions on freedom of expression, freedom of association, and freedom of peaceful assembly, and regulations on political parties, as well as arbitrary detention and reprisals against journalists, human rights defenders, and civil society actors, including women. Fourth, press for rights-based institutional and security sector reform. This should include effective checks and balances on executive power, judicial independence, and independent civilian and institutional oversight of security institutions, transparent vetting, and clear chains of command. International engagement and support should also help ensure that new institutions do not reproduce old patterns of unchecked power. They should also help ensure that new institutions do not allow individuals credibly implicated in serious violations to exercise authority without scrutiny or accountability. At the same time, we urge the Syrian transitional authorities to engage fully with the independent civil society and relevant UN mechanisms to translate these principles into action. Excellencies, the question that must remain at the heart of every discussion about Syria is the following: how do we prevent the return of the conditions that led to war? The answer begins with a state that protects human dignity and freedom, a state in which women are full and equal citizens, not guests at the decision-making table, a sovereign state in which young Syrians can find a future instead of fear. A future instead of fear, weapons, or migration, and a system of justice that respects every victim, regardless of who they are or who committed the violation against them. And I firmly believe that it is not too late. We still have an opportunity to build Syria in which people do not fear the state but trust it to protect them. A Syria that has room for all its children and does not allow what they have endured to be repeated. This is the transition that all Syrians deserve. And this is the peace that can last. Thank you.
Shukran. I thank Ms. Rukbi for her briefing, and I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you to today's briefers, of course. Colleagues, the United States rescinded its designation of Syria as a state sponsor of terrorism on August 24th, a historic milestone that recognizes the progress the Syrian authorities continue to make on political, humanitarian, and security priorities. Lifting U.S. restrictions on Syria will continue to unlock international trade and investment opportunities, contributing to the rebuilding of Syria. A stable, unified Syria at peace with itself and its neighbors will also enhance peace and security for those in the region and beyond. We look forward to further supporting Syria's counterterrorism efforts by building on its membership in the global coalition to defeat ISIS. The United States also applauds Iraq and Syria's July 17th announcement to advance rehabilitation of the Iraq-Syria crude oil pipeline, restoring a critical energy corridor which will make energy more accessible to the global market. We welcome the engagement of a U.S.-led consortium on this project, which advances security and stability through prosperity for both countries. This progress reflects the vision and leadership of President Trump to build a more prosperous and interconnected region. We reiterate our call for UN institutions and member states to support the Syrian government's efforts to advance these goals. We urge the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism, the IIM, and the Independent Institution on Missing Persons in Syria, the IIMP, to work with the Syrian government to finalize MOUs that will enable both of those parties and Syria to provide resources to support the ongoing transitional justice project in Syria. We take note of the IAEA's productive recent visit to Syria and welcome cooperation between the Syrian government and the IAEA toward fulfilling Syria's safeguard obligations related to the Treaty of the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons in a safe and expeditious manner. We also call on both Israel and Syria to seek de-escalation in the aftermath of the August 18th airstrikes on the Abu al-Dahur airbase. The United States will continue to engage closely with both countries and with all regional stakeholders to promote dialogue and peaceful solutions. As we look ahead to High Level Week next month, we encourage members of this Council and all member states to use this opportunity for meaningful engagement with the Syrian government in support of a stable, secure, and prosperous Syria. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Madam President, we thank the Deputy Special Envoy, Secretary General Claudio Cordone, and Acting Assistant Secretary General Indrika Ratwate for their briefings and assessment of the situation in Syria. We heard from the civil society representative, Rola Rukbi. We welcome to this meeting Syria, Qatar, and Turkey. Russia is interested in the earliest possible normalization of the situation in the friendly country of Syria, strengthening its sovereignty and state institutions. We support the focus of Damascus on upholding and protecting the rights of all Syrian citizens, regardless of their ethnic or religious backgrounds. We believe that it is this approach that is the key to an inclusive political process in line with the key provisions of the Cornerstone Resolution of Security Council 2054. We note with satisfaction the progress achieved by the Syrian authorities in this regard. In particular, they've successfully reintegrated the northeastern regions of the country, and they have completed the process of forming the new People's Assembly. We hope that these steps will help to strengthen the unity of the Syrian Arab Republic, and the launch of the parliament's work will give the requisite impetus to the process of adopting a new constitution and other legislation. At the same time, we note that any decisions adopted by all branches of Syrian authority ought to be strictly and unfailingly based upon clearly laid out legal norms and meet the standards of a state governed by rule of law. At the same time, we must note a number of serious challenges and obstacles to the efforts of the Syrian people and government to guarantee lasting stabilization. First of all, this concerns the continuing aggressive actions by Israel on Syrian territory. The latest flagrant examples of this have been the strikes by the Israeli Air Force on the Abu Zuhur air base in the province of Idlib on August 18th, as well as drone attacks on a vehicle near the town of Beit Jin, which led to civilian casualties. These military actions by the IDF, together with the continued occupation of Syrian territory, are a clear violation of international law and the sovereignty of the Syrian Arab Republic, and they undermine efforts to fully resolve the situation in the country. We call on West Jerusalem to stop these military escapades. We remind the Israeli government of the need to fully and unconditionally implement the Disengagement of Forces Agreement of 1974. Continued terrorist activity still poses serious risks for Syria and its people. Bus bombings in the suburbs of Damascus on August 6th and 22nd have been an alarming reminder of this. They led to the injuries of several civilians and law enforcement officers. We note that the Syrian authorities we hope they'll continue to take concrete measures to combat terrorist threats, including foreign combatants, and will bring the perpetrators to justice. We'd like to call on the international community to consolidate efforts to combat terrorist attacks in the Middle East and beyond its borders. Madam President, the situation on the humanitarian front remains alarming. 70% of Syria's population still needs aid. At the same time, the OCHA country humanitarian plan, which is already highly prioritized, has been funded only at the level of 30%. Under these circumstances, we have a positive view of the new allocations from the UN Humanitarian Fund for Syria in the amount of $75 million, which will go to supporting the return of Syrians and their reintegration, as well as the clearing of Syrian territory from explosive objects. It's important for this international assistance to go not only toward current needs, but also toward rebuilding infrastructure and restoring income sources. It is this transition from emergency aid to normalizing the economic and social life of the country that Syria needs. We welcome the close work of the UN bodies with national agencies. Humanitarian aid ought to complement and bolster local capacities instead of replacing them. And here we believe that this is the key element to a true localization of humanitarian activity. We see signs of broader economic revival in Syria. The IMF this year expects double-digit economic growth rates thanks to a recovery of agriculture and an expansion in hydrocarbon extraction as well as electricity generation, and the revival of trade and services. Of course, these positive trends do not mean that accumulated problems caused by or exacerbated by inflation pressure and weak banking systems have been fully resolved. In this regard, we note the decision of the World Bank to provide Syria with a grant in the amount of $100 million to strengthen the financial sector of the country. The facilitation of banking operations, stimulation of trade and investment will be aided by the August 24th removal of Syria from the U.S. list of state sponsors of terrorism. We reaffirm our principled position, which we uphold beyond Syria as well, that is the need to fully refrain from the use of unilateral coercive measures. We cannot, at the same time, call on Syrians to return home and speak of the need to maintain the country's independence while setting up barriers to the country's normal economic functioning. Only a combination of humanitarian aid and full restoration of the national economy can provide Syria with a lasting way out of this long-standing crisis. President, we hope that the Security Council and the international community will take concrete measures to support the authorities in Syria. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Madam President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the A3, namely the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Liberia, and my own country, Somalia. We thank Deputy Special Envoy Cordone and Acting ASG Ratawate for their comprehensive and insightful updates. We have listened carefully to the remarks of Ms. Rugby, and we welcome the participation of the Permanent Representative of Syria in today's meeting. Madam President, the A3 recognizes that Syria is making meaningful strides in its political, security, and economic development, even as it confronts significant challenges. Encouraging recent progress has opened new possibilities for national stability, but their credibility will depend on inclusive participation, effective representation of women and all communities, accountability, and institutions that function independently and transparently. Emphasizing that overcoming ongoing difficulties will require continued united support from the international community to help Syrians build a brighter and more prosperous future. The high-level diplomatic engagement of the United Nations with Syria's transitional authorities, highlighted by the Secretary General Antonio Guterres' historic visit to Damascus and his engagement with the Syrian leadership, civil society, and minority communities, is testimony to this progress. We reiterate our strong support for the vital work of the Special Envoy's Office and reaffirm that Security Council Resolution 2254 remains the essential framework for sustainable Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political settlement. Turning to the humanitarian situation, we remain gravely concerned. Millions of Syrians continue to depend on life-saving assistance, while the 2026 humanitarian response plan is severely underfunded, with only about 1/3 of the required resources secured. Although over 2 million internally displaced persons and nearly 1.8 million refugees have reportedly returned, millions more remain displaced inside Syria or as refugees abroad. Sustainable returns demand safety, adequate housing, schools and health facilities, livelihoods, documentation, protection services, and essential public utilities. Humanitarian relief, early recovery, and reconstruction must therefore advance in tandem. We are encouraged by the improved humanitarian access across most of Syria, with an average of 2.4 million people reached monthly in the first half of 2026. Though we note that localized access challenges and services gap persist, including in the south and part of the northeast. Therefore, we urgently call on the international donors to increase predictable and flexible support, financial support, to bridge critical shortfalls and ensure the continuity of essential services. Explosive ordnance remain a major impediment to safe returns, livelihoods, and recovery. Since the Council's last meeting, there have been reported 53 explosive ordnance incidents, resulting in 20 fatalities, especially in agriculture and grazing areas. The A3 calls for an increased international support for mine action, clearance activities, risk education, and victim assistance measures that are indispensable for civilian protection, food security, and sustainable returns. We also recognize the vital connection between economic recovery and lasting stability. The A3 welcomes recent steps that facilitate Syria's reintegration into the global economy and trade system, including the removal of restrictive designations, the lifting of sanctions barriers, and Syria's removal from the state sponsors of terrorism lists. This paves the way for correspondent banking and foreign investment. As ordinary citizens continue to face inflation and liquidity constraints, we stress that economic stabilization and investment in public utilities and basic infrastructure are vital for long-term recovery. At the same time, we remain deeply alarmed by the persistent violations of Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity. We deplore the recent military strikes and incursions inside Syrian territory, including the August 18th and 19th airstrikes in eastern Idlib. Syria must not become a theater for broader confrontation. Furthermore, the heightened security posture along the Golan Heights and Mount Hermon buffer zone threaten to undermine Syria's recovery efforts as well as risk regional stability. The A3 reiterates that the occupied Syrian Golan is an integral part of Syria in line with Security Council Resolution 497 of 1981 and calls for full respect for Syria's sovereignty, a strict adherence to the 1974 disengagement agreement, and support for efforts to prevent border friction. Terrorism and internal insecurity continue to pose grave threats to Syria and the wider region. The A3 unequivocally condemns the terrorist attack that targeted Syria's internal security forces on August 23rd. As the transitional authorities undertake stabilization operations to neutralize violent extremism networks, including ISIL-Daesh, in central and unstable areas across the country, we emphasize that robust international cooperation, coordination, and capacity building are essential to preventing any resurgence of terrorism in Syria and beyond. In closing, Madam President, the A3 reaffirms its unwavering commitment to Syria's sovereignty, unity, independence, and territorial integrity. We urge the Security Council and the international community to remain steadfast in supporting Syria's journey toward lasting peace, reconciliation, and prosperity, so that all Syrians rebuild their country and shape their future in peace and dignity. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Somalia for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Merci, Madame. Thank you, Madam President. I thank the Deputy Special Envoy, Mr. Claudio Cordone, in acting ASG for Humanitarian Affairs, Indrika Watwate, and Ms. Rola Rukbi for those briefings which highlighted the progress made by Syria over the past few months, as well as the work that still remains to be done. I also welcome participation from Syria, Qatar, and Turkey in this meeting. Madam President, this month marks the 13th anniversary of the chemical weapons attack perpetrated against the population of the neighborhood of Ghouta, and France pays tribute to the victims. Justice must be done, and the ending of the chemical weapons regime of the Assad regime participates in this. The historic visit of the President of France to Syria in July illustrates the shared resolve of our two countries, France and Syria, to overcome the legacy of the previous regime, to help Syria turn the page on this tragic chapter of its history and to rebuild anew. This Council ought to send three messages today. First of all, we must continue the efforts underway as part of the political transition to guarantee a just and lasting peace by combating impunity, first and foremost. The launch of the trial in absentia of former dictator Bashar Assad and members of his regime is an important stage in the process of transitional justice. The work of the national commissions and now of the new Syrian parliament are accelerating with the support of international mechanisms. Next, through consolidating a united and democratic state based upon respect for rule of law and respect for human rights, which brings together all of the elements of the Syrian people and which respects the rights of women who are waiting to take up the rightful place in the Syrian society. France, therefore, welcomes the successful integration of the Syrian Democratic Forces within the Syrian state and their dissolution, which is a historic step toward a sovereign and pluralist Syria. After the progress made in the beginning of this year, thanks to the recognition of the cultural rights of the Kurds, all Syrian communities, Druze, Alawites, Christians, and others, legitimately expect to be harmoniously integrated into the country's civil space. The parliament will have the great responsibility of leading the country toward elections, and we underscore the importance of the participation of women in Syrian politics. The UN can play a key role in this transition, closer to the ground and respecting the state's sovereignty. Secondly, the recovery and reconstruction of Syria are priorities that the entire international community can contribute to. The removal of Syria from the American list of state sponsors of terrorism therefore marks a new step toward the process of lifting sanctions. In parallel, the Syrian authorities are establishing a reliable banking system and a framework to combat corruption to encourage the return of foreign investment. We call on the international community to take part in the reconstruction efforts, including through the restitution of ill-gotten goods. France has led the charge in this regard after announcing the forthcoming restitution of ill-gotten assets to benefit the Syrian people. This goes hand in hand with continued humanitarian efforts at a time when almost 15.6 million people are still in urgent need of aid in the country, and we commend the progress made over the past few months with the return of millions of IDPs and refugees, and we are aware that other efforts must be made to ensure their reintegration into the country. Third, the regional integration of Syria is the key to its long-term stability. The Syrian authorities have expressed their will to establish peaceful relations with all of their neighbors and are taking action in this regard. This is worthy of our full support. We encourage the rapprochement with Lebanon. The resumption of security talks between Syria and Israel is a step in the right direction, which we encourage. We call on Israel to stop its destabilizing incursions on Syrian soil and to respect the disengagement of forces agreement of 1974, as well as to fully respect Syrian sovereignty. These actions jeopardize the efforts made by the Syrian government, which are showing maximum restraint. The territorial integrity of Syria is non-negotiable. Lastly, we encourage the Syrian authorities to unwaveringly pursue the fight against terrorism as part of the international coalition against Daesh, which is crucial to the region's security. And as announced by the President of the Republic during his visit to Damascus, the fight against terrorism is a priority for bilateral cooperation between France and Syria. Madam President, Syria has begun a delicate transition which remains fragile despite the great strides that have been made. To succeed, Syria deserves and needs the support and the trust of our Council. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. I thank the representative of France for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Madam President. And let me thank Deputy Special Envoy Cordone and Acting Assistant Secretary General Ratwate, as well as Ms. Rula Rukbi for the valuable contributions. Almost a year since the Security Council's historic visit to Damascus, the Secretary General's recent visit to Syria marks another important milestone. His presence and engagement there point to a new chapter in Syria's relationship with the UN and, most importantly, in the country's future. I wish to underscore 3 points today. First, progress has been made on both the political transition and transitional justice, although important challenges remain. Greece continues to support a Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political transition which must be truly inclusive, credible, and sustainable. The protection and meaningful political participations of all Syrians, including women, irrespective of ethnicity or religion, must be guaranteed. This is indispensable for Syria's long-term stability and prosperity. A key institution of the political transition, the composition of the People's Assembly, has been finalized. It must safeguard the meaningful participation of all Syrians, regardless of ethnicity or religion, in the political affairs of their country and start work on a constitution which protects and integrates all components of Syrian society. Its work should also contribute to accountability, the rule of law, and ultimately a permanent constitutional order enjoying broad legitimacy. We also note progress on transitional justice, which is essential for reconciliation and rebuilding trust amongst the different components of Syrian society. In this context, we also look forward to the adoption of the forthcoming General Assembly resolution on women searchers of missing persons, which Greece is proud to co-sponsor. Cooperation with the UN mechanism, including the Triple IM and the Double MP, remains critical in this context. We welcome Syria's renewed cooperation with the OPCW, and the restoration of Syria's rights and privileges within the organization clearly demonstrates that constructive engagement with the international community can produce tangible results. The recent breakthrough in cooperation with the IAEA provides another encouraging example of the value of transparency in international engagement. Second, Madam President, we welcome the United States' decision to rescind Syria's designation as a state sponsor of terrorism. This important development can help facilitate reconstruction, investment, and broader economic activity, supporting Syria's recovery and its reconnection with the international community. Prosperity in Syria is key for the prosperity and the stability of the whole region. We are ready to play an active and constructive role to this end. The country's reconstruction can also help create the conditions for the voluntary, safe, and dignified return of Syrians abroad. Third, turning to the security situation, we are encouraged by signs of de-escalation and by the growing emphasis on dialogue and negotiations following recent concerning developments. We welcome the direct talks between Syria and Israel and sincerely hope that they will yield concrete results. We also acknowledge the constructive role played by the United States and Jordan in this context. Greece reiterates its full respect for Syria's sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity. We welcome the implementation of the 29th January Agreement to integrate the SDF and all the relevant military-civilian infrastructures in the Syrian state. This was an important step towards an independent and sovereign Syria encompassing all its components. Equally, the Sweda roadmap must be followed up on and fully implemented 1 year after its adoption. In concluding, Madam President, Greece believes that an inclusive political transition, justice and accountability, economic recovery, and full respect for Syria's sovereignty can together lay the foundations for a peaceful, stable, and prosperous future. The odyssey of the Syrian people has been long and arduous. As the end appears to draw near, Greece stands firmly alongside the Syrian people, mindful that the path ahead remains with many challenges. We stand ready to contribute to this endeavor. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Gracias.
Thank you, Madam President. We are grateful for the briefings by Claudio Cordone, the Deputy Special Envoy for Syria, Indrika Ratwate, the Acting Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs of OCHA, and Rola Rukbi, the Country Director of Women Now for Development Lebanon. Moreover, we recognize the presence of the representatives of the Syrian Arab Republic, Turkey, and Qatar, who honor us with their presence. Madam President, Syria is an ancient nation, and it is a fundamental component of human history and civilization. However, for all too long, its people have suffered the consequences of a conflict in which outside interests have turned its territory into the setting of geopolitical rivalries and confrontations. Panama feels that the time has come for Syria to move towards peace and reconstruction. In this regard, we reiterate our commitment to the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of Syria. Moreover, we believe it is particularly important that legitimate security concerns not be translated into actions or acts of aggression which would further compromise Syrian sovereignty or which would jeopardize the transition that the country is undergoing. In this context, we highlight the constructive efforts of the United States to facilitate dialogue mechanisms, and we call upon all parties to prioritize restraint and de-escalation. Despite the enormous challenges which remain, we can see encouraging elements in the Syrian transition process. We believe it is important that the new People's Assembly fully exercise its functions and that it thus contribute to strengthening political representation and the institutional foundations of the transition. Equally, Syria should continue to make progress on transitional justice after more than a decade of conflict. The victims and their families have the right to justice, truth, and reparation. We reiterate that the full, meaningful participation of women must continue to occupy a central place in the transition process. It is an essential element for building legitimate and inclusive institutions. This represents an important step towards broader and more effective participation of women in all decision-making spaces. Panama also notes the evolving security situation. We recognize positive progress made by Syria, such as the recently announced process of the peaceful integration of the Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF, within the Syrian state. We also believe it is important for the international community to continue to support these efforts. Therefore, we believe that the recent decision by the United States to remove Syria from the list of state sponsors of terrorism is timely and appropriate. This measure represents an important show of confidence in the transformation process that the country is undergoing and could help eliminate obstacles which for years have limited Syria's economic and financial reintegration. Economic recovery is another essential element for Syria's stability, not only as a matter of growth, but also as a condition for giving greater opportunities to the population. Madam President, Panama reiterates its firm support for the work of the United Nations in Syria. We would highlight the recent visit by the Secretary General, and we reiterate our unequivocal support for the relocation of the Office of the Special Envoy to Damascus. We also recognize progress in cooperation between Syrian authorities and UNHCR to facilitate the voluntary, safe, and dignified return of refugees. At the same time, the humanitarian situation remains critical. The international community must not reduce the attention it pays to Syria precisely when the country is beginning to enter a new phase of hope. Panama welcomes the recent progress made in Syria's cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency, in particular the decision by the Syrian authorities to declare the presence of nuclear material and to facilitate access for the agency's inspectors. In broader terms, this progress represents an encouraging sign of Syria's increasing commitment to the multilateral system and to its specialized agencies. Madam President, the path towards a new Syria, one that is rooted in human dignity, the participation of all of its peoples, and lasting peace, constitutes an effort that should be highlighted. Panama will continue to support a sovereign, united, stable, and peaceful Syria, one that is fully integrated within the international community and that is supported by United Nations that is present and committed to the needs of the Syrian people. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Panama for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Bahrain.
Madam President, I would like to thank Mr. Claudio Cordoni, Deputy Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Syria, and Mr. Enrique Ratuati, Assistant Secretary General for Acting Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, and we took note of Ms. Rola Rukbi's briefings. I welcome also the participation of the permanent representatives of the Syrian Arab Republic, the State of Qatar, and the Republic of Turkey. Madam President, the Kingdom of Bahrain follows with interest the political developments in the sisterly Syrian Arab Republic, and we affirm our support for all effort undertaken by the Syrian government to strengthen its security and stability, and to preserve Syria's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity and unity. We reject all interference and attacks that would undermine these principles in accordance with the Charter of the UN and international law. The Kingdom believes that Syria is today undergoing a critical phase that requires the international community to unify its effort in support of the brotherly Syrian people in achieving their legitimate aspirations for security, stability, development, and prosperity. In this context, the Kingdom of Bahrain welcomes the announcement by the U.S. to remove the sisterly Syrian Arab Republic from the list of state sponsors of terrorism, considering it a positive step that supports reconstruction effort, economic recovery, and Syria's reintegration into the international community. In a related context, the Kingdom welcomes the announcement of the integration of the Syrian Democratic Forces and all their affiliated military and civilian structures into the institutions of the Syrian state as an important step in support of the unity of the Syrian Arab Republic. The Kingdom commends the progress made in building Syrian state institutions, including the convening of the People's Assembly. We appreciate the effort undertaken by the Syrian government and the relevant national committees in the areas of transitional justice and missing persons, which supports national reconciliation and peaceful coexistence and enhances the participation of various components of Syrian society in building the country's future. The Kingdom of Bahrain also welcomes the visit undertaken by His Excellency the Secretary General to Damascus last July, the first visit by United Nations Secretary General to Syria since 2009. And the discussions and meetings it included with the Syrian leadership and representatives of the components of the Syrian society. The Kingdom hopes that this visit will contribute to supporting Syria during this phase, strengthening cooperation between Syria and the UN. It will also mobilize international support for recovery and reconstruction, as well as create the appropriate conditions for the voluntary, safe, and dignified return of refugees and displaced persons. Madam President, the Kingdom of Bahrain expresses its strong condemnation and denunciation of the recent Israeli attacks on the Syrian territory, including the raids that targeted Abu al-Juhur air base in northwest Syria and the recent attack in the vicinity of the town of Beit Jenin in the Damascus countryside, considering them flagrant violations of Syria's sovereignty and territorial unity and integrity, and a blatant breach of the rules of international law and the Charter of the UN, as well as a threat to the security and stability of the region. We stress the necessity of Israel's withdrawal from the occupied Syrian territories, including the occupied Syrian Golan, and the full compliance with the 1974 Disengagement of Forces Agreement and relevant Security Council resolutions, including Resolution 497, and the need to halt escalation and avoid any actions that would undermine the security and stability in Syria and the region. Here, the Kingdom of Bahrain welcomes the adoption by the Security Council of Resolution 2824, which renewed the mandate of UNDOV for an additional 6 months. We appreciate the role played by the force in implementing its mandate and monitoring the ceasefire and the area of separation. We affirm the importance of ensuring the safety and security of its personnel and enabling it to carry out its mandate in its tasks in accordance with the mandate. Madam President, the Kingdom of Bahrain reaffirms its full solidarity with the Syrian Arab Republic. We support the measures taken by the government to consolidate the country's security and stability. Here, we renew our condemnation of the terrorist bombing that targeted a passenger bus in the city of Jarmana in the Damascus countryside earlier this month. We reaffirm our firm position rejecting all acts of violence and terrorism in all their forms and manifestations. These aim to destabilize the country and undermine security and terrorize innocent civilians. The Kingdom calls for intensification of regional and international effort to combat terrorism and extremism. We need to prevent terrorist organizations from exploiting any security vacuum to regroup or threaten the security of Syria and the region as a whole, as well as for strengthening cooperation in combating the smuggling of drugs and weapons, while stressing the importance of protecting civilians and enhancing security and stability in support of the aspirations of the brotherly Syrian people for peace, development, and prosperity. In closing, we encourage the international community and donors to continue supporting the humanitarian response in Syria in light of the continuing expansion of the needs and the shortfall in funding. We must guarantee that assistance reaches all those in need without obstruction, in addition to strengthening early recovery efforts, rehabilitation of infrastructure and basic services, supporting mine action and the clearance of explosive remnants of war, creating an enabling environment for reconstruction and preserving Syria's security and stability towards peace, growth, and prosperity. I thank you.
Representative of Latvia.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Deputy Special Envoy for Syria, Mr. Claudio Cordone, and Acting ASG for OCHA, Mr. Indrika Ratvate, for their informative briefings. And I also thank Country Director of Women Now for Development, Lebanon, Ms. Rola Rugby, for contributing to today's discussion. And I also welcome the participation of the representatives of the Syrian Arab Republic, Qatar, and Turkey to today's meeting. Syria's resolute efforts towards stability and economic recovery make a significant contribution to the entire region. Continued and increased international support is needed to assist Syria in sustaining this progress on its path to prosperity and peace. Against this backdrop, I would like to underline 3 points. First, recent Israeli strikes on the Abu Duhur air base in northern Syria raised deep concerns about the risk of strategic miscalculation and escalation. We urge all parties to exercise restraint and give way to diplomacy. And we welcome the mediation efforts of the United States and Jordan that have culminated in the establishment of the security deconfliction mechanism, and urge all parties to engage in it in good faith. Ensuring security interests through military force is not sustainable in the long run. Therefore, we encourage Israel and Syria to resume negotiations to reach mutually acceptable security arrangements while upholding international law, respecting Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and protecting civilians on both sides of the border. We recognize the political restraint that Syria has demonstrated, encountering ground raids and strikes that continue to violate the 1974 disengagement agreement in the Syrian Golan. And we reiterate our firm commitment to the unity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic. While noting the recent arrangements that place the former Russian-operated bases under Syrian administration and welcoming efforts to enhance Syrian ownership and control, we continue to have concerns about the implications of Russia's continued military presence in Syria for regional stability and security. Second, although much has been done in terms of economic recovery, humanitarian needs in Syria remain immense, as we heard in today's briefing too. The growing number of Syrians returning to their communities demonstrates both a strong desire to rebuild their lives and an opportunity to support Syria on a path towards greater stability and recovery. Yet returns must be accompanied by conditions that allow people to live safely and with dignity. Explosive ordnance contamination has emerged as one of the most pressing challenges, continuing to claim lives, cause injuries, and impede safe access to homes, agricultural land, and essential services. Adequate and sustained funding, together with continued international support, will be essential to address immediate humanitarian needs, expand demining, and enable returning communities to rebuild their livelihoods. And we welcome the US decision to rescind Syria's designation as a state sponsor of terrorism. This significant development acknowledges the ongoing political and security transformation undertaken by Syria and has the potential to foster the growth of investment and business activity in the country and the region. Third, governance, justice, and continued international cooperation will be essential for Syria's new chapter. Successful consolidation and strengthening of Syria's governing institutions, women's meaningful participation in decision-making, and broad political representation of ethnic and religious communities, including in the People's Assembly, are key elements of the cohesion of Syria's diverse society. The recent announcement of the dissolution of the SDF and the ongoing integration of Northeast Syria's administration into state institutions demonstrate meaningful efforts to build an inclusive and united country. We also encourage dialogue among all parties to reach a sustainable solution for Sueda. Syria's pursuit of transitional justice is an important chapter in national reconciliation. Those responsible for serious crimes must be held accountable with full respect for due process and bringing an end to the impunity of Assad regime and reinstating the rule of law at the core of the new Syria. We call on states to cooperate with and support Syria's commitment to hold accountable the former Assad regime officials who directed, committed, and oversaw widespread and systematic attacks against the Syrian civilian population. We have repeatedly expressed our support for the fruitful and meaningful cooperation between the Syrian authorities and the OPCW in order to eliminate all remnants of Assad's chemical weapons program. The voluntary reporting of previously undeclared nuclear material and the recently announced cooperation with the IAEA to fully implement necessary safeguards represent another important step forward as Syria continues its path towards compliance, responsibility, and transparency. To conclude, Madam President, we strongly welcome Syria's constructive approach to fostering relations with the United Nations. With the Secretary General's recent visit to Syria, which took place at a meaningful moment for the Syrian people, the UN demonstrated that alongside humanitarian aid, it can make a significant contribution to fostering Syria's political transition, institution building, and reconstruction. We look forward to the practical implementation of the outlined cooperation, and in this regard, relocation of the Special Envoy's office to Damascus would be beneficial. Once again recognizing the determination of Syrian people to pursue stability, peace, and economic recovery, Latvia reiterates its unwavering support to these shared goals. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Latvia for the statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of China.
President, I thank Deputy Special Envoy Cordone and Acting Assistant Secretary General Ratwat for their briefings. I've also listened attentively to the statement by Civil Society Representative Rukbi. I welcome the representatives of Syria, Qatar, and Turkey to today's meeting. A month ago, during his visit to Syria, Secretary General Guterres stated that Syria was at a moment of possibility, with the opportunity to build a more stable, more inclusive, and more prosperous future for all Syrians. This assessment reflects both the prevailing view of the international community on the situation in Syria and a shared expectation for the country's future. The Syrian transitional government should seize this opportunity, adopt sound domestic and foreign policies, strengthen its governance capacity, respond to the concerns of the international community through concrete actions, and work toward the early restoration of peace and stability and the achievement of sustainable development in the country. In this vein, I will make 3 points. First, it's crucial to remain steadfast to an inclusive political transition. Recently, Syria's Interim People's Assembly adopted its rules of procedure, and new progress has been made in the integration of northeastern Syria. Meanwhile, in the southwest, there are still sporadic sectarian clashes, and the security situation remains tense and fragile. Advancing an inclusive political transition based on the principle of Syrian leadership and ownership remains the consensus of the international community. The Syrian transitional government should focus on reconstruction as its fundamental objective, ensure the full participation of all segments of the Syrian society in the transition process, build the broadest possible consensus, promote national reconciliation, and prevent further divisions. It should fully respect Syria's multicultural reality, accommodate the religious and cultural differences among communities, and equally protect the legitimate rights and interests of all groups. It is our hope that Syria will facilitate the relocation of the office of the SG's Special Envoy for Syria to Damascus and its operation. Second, it is imperative to relentlessly combat terrorist forces. Terrorism remains a major threat to restoring stability in Syria. According to the Secretary General's report, following the closure of detention facilities in northeastern Syria, the whereabouts of large numbers of individuals affiliated to terrorist organizations and their family remain unknown. Some may rejoin terrorist organizations or other armed groups, thereby further heightening regional security risks. The report of the 1267 Committee monitoring team indicates that thousands of FTFs remain active in Syria, some of whom are recruiting personnel and raising funds within the country to strengthen their capabilities. China urges the Syrian transitional government to stay resolved to fight terrorism, take effective measures, and resolutely combat all terrorist organizations designated by the Security Council, including the Eastern Turkestan Islamic Movement, or ETIM. Third, it is essential to sustain humanitarian development assistance. Thanks to the joint efforts of all parties, Syria's humanitarian situation has been improving, which deserves recognition. At the same time, the enormous unaddressed humanitarian needs in Syria, the volatile security environment, and skyrocketing prices all pose additional challenges to the economic recovery in the country. China supports the Syrian transitional government in focusing on the development agenda, properly addressing security concerns of foreign investors, advancing economic reconstruction, and continuously improving people's livelihood. The Damascus International Fair is currently underway, which we hope will serve as a platform that positively contributes to Syria's economic development. The international community should increase humanitarian and development assistance to Syria, help restore its domestic market, facilitate its integration into regional and international economic cooperation, and remove once and for all the root causes of instability. President, after more than a decade of war and turmoil, all sectors of the Syrian society oppose being drawn into new conflicts. Preserving Syria's security and stability will contribute to improving the overall situation in the Middle East. China condemns Israel's attacks on Syria and calls on all parties to genuinely respect Syria's sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity. The Golan Heights are internationally recognized as occupied Syrian territory, and parties concerned have an obligation to implement the 1974 Disengagement of Forces Agreement. Israel should withdraw from Syrian territory as soon as possible. China stands ready to continuously play a constructive role together with the international community towards the early achievement of security and development in Syria and the early restoration of peace and stability across the Middle East. I thank you, President.
And I thank the representative of China for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Madam President. We thank Deputy Special Envoy Cordone and OCHA Acting ASG Ratwate for their briefings. We have also listened carefully to the perspective shared by Ms. Rukbi. Madam President, we are extremely pleased to see that the discussion on Syria has transformed. After years of conflict, fragmentation, and humanitarian emergency in the country, there is now a genuine opportunity to focus on stabilization, recovery, and return to normalcy. That opportunity must be seized, preserved, and supported. An essential part of this effort is the continued consolidation of the Syrian state and its institutions. The integration of the Syrian democratic forces into state structures is an important development in that regard. Alongside this, we are heartened to witness the significant progress in the political transition, continuing to broadening participation, strengthening national cohesion, and responding to the aspirations of the Syrian people. Ultimately, sustainable stability can only emerge from a peaceful, inclusive, Syrian-owned and Syrian-led political process. The visit of Syria's foreign minister to Pakistan last week, at the invitation of our Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, reflected the renewed commitment and momentum in our long-standing brotherly relations. Both sides expressed their determination to deepen political engagement and expand cooperation in areas of mutual interest. The same spirit of constructive engagement is being witnessed internationally. The easing of economic restrictions on Syria, including the lifting of sanctions and designations by the United States, has created greater space for economic recovery and international reintegration. Increasing cooperation and investment from countries in the region and beyond has provided further reason for optimism. The measure of success, however, will be whether these developments translate into economic activity, accelerate reconstruction, and bring tangible improvements to the lives of people, all of which is on a positive trajectory. This is particularly important because the humanitarian situation has not fully abated. Millions continue to depend on assistance. Humanitarian support must therefore be sustained even as greater attention is devoted to recovery and reconstruction. Syria's emerging stability must also be protected against terrorism. Daesh and foreign terrorist fighters continue to pose a serious threat. Coordinated counter-terrorism efforts remain essential to prevent its resurgence and preserve Syria's hard-won stability. At the same time, the difficult legacy of the conflict must be addressed through transitional justice, pursued fairly, impartially, and in a manner that contributes to national reconciliation. We also recognize the wisdom shown by the Syrian leadership in a region experiencing heightened tensions and confrontation. Syria has prudently sought to avoid being drawn into a wider conflict. Against all this backdrop, Israeli military escalation against Syria is deeply concerning. Pakistan strongly condemns the attack carried out by Israel on Abu al-Duhur airbase in violation of international law. Full respect for the 1974 disengagement agreement must be ensured, alongside the complete withdrawal of Israeli forces from all occupied areas. These are essential steps to prevent further escalation and safeguard regional peace and stability. We also reiterate that the Syrian Golan is an occupied Syrian territory, as reaffirmed by Security Council Resolutions 338 and 497. Pakistan reiterates its full support for the sovereignty and territorial integrity, as well as peace and prosperity of Syria. Syria has endured more than a decade of devastating conflict. Syria's priority today is to move decisively towards a future of unity, stability, and prosperity. And Pakistan will continue to stand with the brotherly Syrian people in that endeavor. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Colombia.
Muchas gracias, señora. Thank you very much, Madam President. Colombia expresses its thanks to the Deputy Special Envoy for Syria, Mr. Claudio Cordone, the Acting Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Mr. Indrika Ratwate, and Ms. Rola Rukbi for the information they have provided today. We also welcome the presence of the delegations that are joining us today in the room. My delegation welcomes the progress that has been seen in Syria's political transition, including the establishment of new institutions and efforts to strengthen the country's governance. The transition is still in a delicate phase and requires sustained support in order to consolidate effective representative institutions that are able to meet the expectations of the Syrian population. In this context, Colombia would highlight the visit of the Secretary General of the United Nations to Syria on the 25th and 26th of July, the first one since 2009. This visit reflects the United Nations' commitment to supporting the transition, and it sends a positive signal of support for this process, which is led by the Syrians themselves. Moreover, Colombia believes it is essential for the United Nations to continue to play an active role and a proactive role in the strengthening of this new phase, and calls for more progress to be made in discussions related to the possible relocation of the Special Envoy's office in Damascus. Madam President, Colombia expresses its concern over the persistent security challenges, including the threat that Daesh continues to pose to Syria and the region. Attacks seen in the month of July, including the attack that the Syrian authorities attributed to elements affiliated to Daesh in Damascus, are evidence that terrorist groups continue to pose a threat to the civilian population and to the consolidation of the country's political transition. On the humanitarian front, we note that despite political progress and expectations of double-digit economic growth in 2026, according to the International Monetary Fund, needs continue to be vast. According to OCHA, 15.6 million Syrians continue to need humanitarian assistance and are facing difficulties in accessing basic services, housing, and livelihoods. My delegation takes note of the report on financial limitations facing the humanitarian response in Syria, whose appeal for 2026, the OCHA appeal, is currently about 30% funded. Colombia therefore highlights the importance of maintaining international support for the humanitarian response. Thank you very much, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Colombia for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President, and I would like to thank Deputy Special Envoy Cordone, Acting Assistant Secretary General Ratwate, and Country Director of Women Now for Development, Rugby, for their briefings. I also welcome the participation of representatives of the Syrian Arab Republic, Turkey and Qatar to this meeting. President, after decades of conflict and turmoil, Syria has an opportunity to move towards a peaceful, stable and prosperous future. The United Kingdom welcomes Secretary General Guterres' successful visit to Damascus. This was a milestone in Syria's political recovery and in the deepening relationship between the government of Syria and the United Nations. We hope that cooperation will continue to strengthen, including through the timely relocation of the Special Envoy's office to Damascus. We also welcome the recent announcement of the dissolution of the Syrian Democratic Forces into central government structures. This is an important step towards a peaceful, stable and unified Syria. The United Kingdom fully supports Syria's territorial integrity and sovereignty, and we stand ready to support the government as it continues to strengthen its institutions. Progress within Syria must be matched across the region. We therefore welcome the direct Israel-Syria talks held earlier this week in Jordan. They're a positive step towards long-term peace. We encourage both sides to continue dialogue to strengthen the security of each country and the wider region. Further strikes, such as those in Idlib last week, risk undermining Syria's hard-won progress at this pivotal moment. President, last week marked 13 years since the horrific Ghouta attack. More than 1,400 people were killed when the Assad regime used a sarin nerve agent against its own citizens. Today, we remember the victims and their families. The United Kingdom remains unwavering in its opposition to the use of chemical weapons by anyone, anywhere, under any circumstances. Their use represents a grave violation of international law and one of the darkest chapters of the Syrian conflict. We welcome the steps the government of Syria has taken towards closing this chapter. We continue to support Syria's recovery through the Breadth of Freedom Task Force and the government of Syria's constructive partnership with the OPCW. We also welcome the United States' decision to remove Syria's designation as a state sponsor of terrorism. This is another important step on Syria's path towards prosperity and stability. President, despite this progress, challenges remain. More than 50 million people require humanitarian assistance. More than 7 million are acutely food insecure. Ongoing sectarian tensions, alongside wider regional instability and violence, risk destabilizing hard-won peace. The task for the international community is clear. We must work with and in support of the government of Syria to protect and build on this progress. With sustained support, Syria can move beyond the dangers and divisions of its past and towards a more stable and peaceful future. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for the statement, and I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Denmark. And let me start by thanking Deputy Special Envoy Cordone and Acting Assistant Secretary General Ratwati for their briefings. I also wish to thank Ms. Rugby for her strong messages today and for her incredible courage and impact throughout the Syrian uprising and beyond. I also wish to welcome the permanent representatives of Syria, Qatar, and Turkey to our meeting. Colleagues, the Secretary General's visit to Syria in July was historic and represented a clear sign of the UN's strong support for Syria. As we heard, he returned with a positive message about the hope and the opportunities he experienced during his visit, a far cry from the dark, sobering statements that for years characterized the Syria discussions in this council. The government of Denmark is planning to soon reopen the Danish embassy that was closed for security reasons during the height of the uprising in the summer of 2012. The decision to reopen the embassy shows Denmark's willingness to engage with and support the new Syria. Another important development since our last meeting is Syria's renewed commitment to cooperation with the IAEA, which we welcome. This marks the most significant advance to date in the cooperation between Syria and the agency and is a clear rupture with the previous regime's dark past. This constructive engagement with the international community could be further strengthened through the presence of a restructured Office of the Special Envoy in Damascus as soon as possible. Colleagues, in spite of many positive developments, some major challenges remain. An inclusive political transition is on top of everyone's mind, as is the ongoing transitional justice process. As Ms. Rugby stated, women's rights and women's participation must be at the center of this Council's engagement on Syria. The participation of women, minorities, youth and civil society is integral to the success of the political transition. We also acknowledge the important role women play in Syria's transitional justice process. For years, women have searched for the missing, collected testimonies and gathered evidence. We were pleased to recently co-host an area formula meeting on transitional justice with constructive and active participation from authorities in Damascus. It is important that all relevant actors, Syria as well as international mechanisms, contribute to the process and that we as international community continuously support the Syrian-owned transitional justice process while upholding international standards. Beyond Syria's long-term political transition, the needs of its people remain immense and immediate, with 15.6 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. As we heard from the Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator, the 2026 Humanitarian Response Plan is currently only 1/3 funded. More needs to be done to meet these critical needs. Next month, the school year will begin for many Syrian children. However, with almost 2.5 million children out of school and another 1.6 million at risk of losing their access due to displacement and economic hardship, this merits our sustained attention. Finally, while Syria has many internal challenges, maybe the most serious stem from regional instability and foreign interference. We reiterate that Syria's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity must be respected. The resolutions of this Council and the General Assembly on the occupied Syrian Golan are clear. They must be upheld by all members. We're deeply concerned about recent Israeli airstrikes on the Abu al-Duhur military airport in Idlib Governorate. Such actions constitute a dangerous escalation that could further destabilize regional stability. Statements from the Israeli government about remaining indefinitely in zones inside Syria are unacceptable and undermine efforts towards a durable peace. We commend Syria for pursuing a diplomatic solution to these tensions. Colleagues, Syria is moving towards a more stable and prosperous future. For it to succeed, we must continue to support the inclusive political transition, sustain and strengthen international humanitarian support, and work to ensure respect for Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Those are all important prerequisites for the continued success of the new Syria. Denmark will keep working with Syria and this Council to reach that future. And I now resume my function as President of the Council. I give the floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
Thank you, Madam President. I would also like to thank the members of the Security Council for their continued support for the new Syria. I thank you for your leadership of the Council for this month, and today's meeting coincides with the visit of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Denmark to reopen the embassy in Damascus soon. I would also like to renew my appreciation to the briefers for their continued support for Syria and the Syrian people, men and women. I thank Ms. Rula from the civil society for the briefing that she gave, and I am pleased that you and the Secretary General saw for yourself at Damascus how new Syria embraces civil society and hears its voice. This society played an important role in the revolution, and we hear their voices clearly in the Council and in the country. Madam President, I will begin my statement today by speaking of the end of an era and the beginning of another, and this is reflected in 3 milestones that happened during this month alone. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, with the visit of the Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, to Damascus, an era of tension between the United Nations and Syria has come to an end. In that visit, we crowned a new phase that began after liberation, a phase whose title is Partnership. Secretary General witnessed the success story that is being written by Syrian men and Syrian women after long years of struggle and sacrifice. He saw firsthand in the field the achievements that Syria has made in confronting the challenges that it faces. He met with the United Nations forces, UNDOF, and he met with the people of southern Syria who suffer from the Israeli forces kidnapping their sons and daughters and the forced disappearances of their loved ones. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, with the visit of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees to Damascus, to Syria, the era of displacement and refugees has come to an end, and a new era began, one entitled Return. Mr. Barham Saleh saw for himself what he witnessed, a historic turning point that the country now stands at. He called for seizing the opportunity created by the return of more than 3 million Syrians through the international community's investment in recovery services and livelihoods. However, strengthening this return and making it a sustainable one requires continued support for Syria's recovery and stability. Colleagues, with the visit of the Director General of the IAEA to Damascus, the era of ambiguity ended and a new era began, one called clarity. The visit of Mr. Grossi represented the most significant progress in the history of cooperation between Syria and the IAEA in addressing issues inherited from the former regime. It opened a new phase of broader cooperation, including in the peaceful uses of nuclear science and technology in support of national development priorities. Madam President, the new Syria continues its return to the international community. After 47 years, Syria's name was officially removed from the U.S. list of state sponsors of terrorism. We extend our sincere thanks to His Excellency President Donald Trump for his vision and for what we achieve and what we can hope to achieve once the handcuffs are removed. The shackles are removed. Likewise, with the Russian Federation, an understanding has been reached that lays a foundation for a new phase in historic relations between our two countries and our two peoples that is based on shared interests. These days, we commemorate the 70th anniversary of diplomatic relations between Syria and China, amid a steady development of relations between the two countries. And as our colleague, the Permanent Representative of Pakistan, noted, the recent visit of the Foreign Minister to Pakistan, the first of its kind in many years, this visit has restored momentum to bilateral relations and opened new horizons for political cooperation and economic and trade cooperation as well. Colleagues, we have ended an era called an era of isolation, and we began a new era called openness. Madam President, yesterday, our mothers' tears fell before the executioners of the former regime. They were tears of grief, helplessness, and pleas for mercy. Today, our mothers shed tears before the executioners of the former regime, now behind bars. Their tears are tears of joy, of victory, and of dignity. The judiciary has issued its rulings against Bashar al-Assad, Maher al-Assad, Atif Najib, and a number of figures from the former regime for the violations and crimes they've committed against Syrian women and men. These trials were fair and impartial. They were attended by the victims' families, journalists, representatives of the international community, and international organizations. And here, the Lebanese judicial authorities, and we thank them for this, have handed over a former officer wanted by the Syrian authorities, wanted on charges of murder and torture. And from this platform, the Security Council, we renew our call to all countries to cooperate with Syria in pursuing fugitives and supporting the course of transitional justice, because handing them over will protect other countries from the consequences of their criminal activities. Madam President, what was a complicated issue a month ago on the ground, just months ago on the ground, has in this council become a reality, and it has become an example to be followed. The integration of the Syrian Democratic Forces into the ranks of the Syrian Arab Army has been completed, and their dissolution has been officially announced. We have achieved a genuine process of national integration that is based on equality among citizens and not sectarian quotas disguised under the banner of inclusiveness. These are the firm foundations upon which the new Syria is being built. In the new Syria, the rights and freedoms of all components are not open to bargaining or dispute. Differences are addressed through dialogue first. Wisdom is our choice, and higher national interests are our compass. And when reason and logic prevail, when context and changing circumstances are properly understood, and when regional and when our national will supersedes narrow interests, then there are no victors and no losers in Syria. Syria will be the winner, and all of the Syrian people will be the winners. Madam President, as we make progress on the tracks of politics and traditional justice, the economy is also moving forward. Direct flights between Syria and Germany have resumed, for example, and soon they will resume to other European destinations after long years of interruption. Air traffic to and from Syrian airports is increasing. We're receiving business delegations and business boards. The Central Bank of Syria has launched new measures in the field of electronic payment and transfers to modernize the financial sector, facilitate transactions, and encourage investment. The Anti-Money Laundering and Counterterrorist Financing Authority launched its national strategy to prepare for Syria's removal from the enhanced follow-up list known as the Grey List in cooperation with the Middle East and North Africa Financial Action Task Force. The historic statue of Saint Simeon, the stylite, has been returned to Aleppo after suffering damage during previous years. Yesterday, as colleagues noted, we opened the 63rd edition of the Damascus International Fair, and we lit the torch or the furnaces of the gas plants in Deir ez-Zor following its rehabilitation. Some may wonder why I am presenting such minor economic details in a chamber accustomed to discussing war and crises. But for Syrians, men and women, restoring a direct flight, or opening a bank account, or being able to transfer funds electronically, or establishing a company, or securing a job opportunity, these are not minor details. Rather, these are signs of the return of life itself, of the restoration of peace and security. Madam President. However, at a time when Syria continues to secure its borders, to combat terrorism, dismantle drug trafficking networks, and close files inherited from the former regime, such as the nuclear file, the chemical file, and while you yourselves commend Syria's achievements, Israel continues to move in exactly the opposite direction. Israel conducted 8 airstrikes against the Abu Dhuhr airport. It continued its incursions into Syrian territory. It persists in its acts of aggression, including abductions, shelling, and violations. Violations that do not stop. Not to mention the irresponsible display by Minister Katz atop the Mount Hermon in a blatant defiance of international legitimacy and the resolutions of this Council. All of this happens while Syria exercises, with your very own testimony today, it exercises utmost restraint to spread the region, not just Syria, further suffering and tragedy. We are engaging seriously and responsibly in the U.S.-sponsored diplomatic efforts that are aimed at consolidating security and reducing escalation. Imagine that the entire region is standing at the threshold of a regional war that would spare no one because of the narrow electoral calculations of the Israeli Prime Minister. Imagine that all international and regional efforts that have been made for months to achieve security and stability in the region are now threatened to be blown away by the delusions that exist only in the imagination of a reckless and extremist government. Colleagues, you do not need to imagine this because this is, unfortunately, the reality that we're living. These attacks will not change our path. They will not change Syria's choice for stability. Stability that, if Israel wants the stability, then it can only be achieved by ending Israeli attacks, stopping the incursions, complying fully with the 1974 disengagement agreement, and withdrawing from the territories that it has occupied since the 8th of December. As for the occupied Syrian Golan, your Honorable Council has settled this issue decades ago. Allow me to quote from your own resolution, Resolution 497, which states that, I quote, Israel's decision to impose its laws, jurisdiction, and administration in the occupied Syrian Golan null and void, and with no international legal effect, end of quote. Yes, the Golan is not disputed territory. It is occupied Syrian land. It will return to its Syrian people no matter how long it takes. This was reaffirmed by the General Assembly by virtue of its resolution this year, where the number of countries voting in its favor increased from 97 states to 123 states. In closing, Madam President, we know what it means to say that we have liberated Damascus. It is as if Damascus and history are twins that cannot be separated. Damascus is a cradle of civilization and religions. It is the place of many empires. It is the pearl of the East. It has always overcome hardship. It has always triumphed over adversity. Damascus is rising once again with the legacy of thousands of years and looking confidently towards the future. And as His Excellency the President of the Republic said, Damascus holds in one hand its sharp Damascene sword, and in the other hand its silk and soft Damascene fabrics. And between firmness and gentleness, Syrian diplomacy exists. It gives every rightful claim its due. It opens its doors to all those who come to it as partners, supporting its stability and recovery. Welcome. Welcome to all those who come to Damascus as guests and as partners, not as aggressors or invaders. I thank you, Madam President.
Shukran. I thank the representative of Syrian Arab Republic for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Turkey.
Thank you, Madam President. At the outset, I would like to thank Acting ASG Mr. Ratwat, Deputy Special Envoy Mr. Cordon, and Ms. Rukbi for their comprehensive briefings. Madam President, despite the continuing challenges, Syria is steadily advancing along the path towards stabilization. We are encouraged by the progress made by the People's Assembly towards becoming a fully functioning legislative institution. The Assembly will assume an increasingly effective role in advancing inclusive governance and responding to the aspirations of all segments of Syrian society. We also take note of the progress achieved in judicial process related to transitional justice and accountability. Sustaining momentum in these areas will be essential to strengthening public confidence in the state institutions and advancing an inclusive political process. Madam President, Syria's constructive engagement with the international community is equally important. In this regard, we welcome the recent visit of International Atomic Agency Director General Grossi to Syria and commend the Syrian government for its meaningful cooperation with the agency. Building on the progress achieved on the chemical weapons file with the support of OPCW and the Breadth of Freedom Task Force, this constructive engagement further demonstrates Syria's determination to address the grim legacy of Assad regime and to fulfill its international obligations. International community should continue to support and reinforce this positive trajectory. At the same time, sustaining reconstruction and recovery efforts and bringing the integration process to a swift and successful conclusion remain essential to consolidating lasting peace, security, and stability throughout Syria. Syria deserves congratulations on these areas. We also welcome the decision of the USA to remove Syria from the state sponsors of terrorism list. We commend the constructive approach of the US administration and congratulate the Syrian government and people. We believe that this decision will give further impetus to efforts to advance Syria's economic recovery and reconstruction, strengthen Syria's ties with the international community, and establish lasting security and stability in the country. However, Israel continues to undermine this positive trajectory through its reckless attacks and destabilizing actions against Syria. The recent airstrikes on the Abu al-Duhur air base constitute yet another example of such actions. We condemn Israel's relentless attacks targeting Syria's infrastructure and capabilities in blatant violation of Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Madam President, strengthening Syria's national capabilities is a sovereign right. It does not constitute a threat to any country. Turkey's relations with the countries of the region, including Syria, are guided by our firm commitment to their stability, security, and prosperity. And it is well proven over decades, especially during all years of conflict in Syria. We regard these three elements as indispensable not only for our own national security, but also for regional and international security. A shared commitment to these objectives by all countries would make a significant contribution to lasting peace and stability in the region. Conversely, attempts to obstruct Syria's efforts to build and strengthen its security capacity would only risk creating conditions conducive to the resurgence of terrorist organizations such as Daesh. Turkey's military cooperation with Syria is conducted with the consent of the Syrian government. None of our activities in Syria are directed against or pose a threat to any third country. Madam President, developments in the south of the country also remain a source of concern. Israel's aggression, which continues to affect civilians and undermine stability, must cease. In this context, we reiterate our call on Israel to fully comply with the 1974 Disengagement Forces Agreement, refrain from further escalatory actions, and reverse its encroachments. International community, and this Council in particular, must use all means at its disposal to bring an end to Israel's aggression against Syria and its occupation of Syrian territory. Madam President, having stood firmly by the Syrian people throughout the 14 years of conflict, Turkey will continue to be an enabling partner for all those willing to contribute constructively to preserving Syria's unity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity, and to establishing lasting peace, stability, and prosperity of the country. Madam President, I will happily accept invitation by Syrian Permanent Representative to return to Damascus after 20 years as a diplomat. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Turkey for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Qatar.
السيدة الرئيسة أشكركم على
Madam President, thank you for convening this meeting, and we would also like to thank the briefers for their statements, and I have the honor to deliver the statement on behalf of the states members of the Group of Arab States. At the outset, the Arab Group reaffirms its firm position in support of the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic. We reject external interference in its internal affairs and any attempt to undermine its security and stability. We affirm that the unity and stability of Syria constitute a pillar of the security and stability of the region. The Arab Group commends the steps taken by the Syrian government towards extending state authority over its entire territory and in the fields of transitional justice, accountability, and missing persons, as well as efforts to create conditions conducive to the return of refugees and displaced persons. The Arab Group calls for support for the Syrian government in a manner that contributes to the maintenance and promotion of stability. The group also calls for international support and investment and strengthening of economic cooperation to serve the economic recovery and reconstruction process, and also to create the right conditions for the safe, dignified, and sustainable voluntary return of refugees and displaced persons, including services, infrastructure, livelihoods, and demining. The Arab Group calls for the removal of the remaining obstacles that hinder the recovery and economic and international integration of the Syrian Arab Republic. In the same context, the Arab Group appreciates the great role played by states hosting Syrian refugees. We call the international community to increase and expand support to host states, which cannot, on their own, bear this burden on behalf of the international community. That is until refugees return to their country. The Arab Group welcomes the growing cooperation between the Syrian government and the United Nations, which recently culminated in the visit to Syria on the part of the Secretary General of the United Nations and the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, as well as cooperation and coordination with the International Atomic Energy Agency and the OPCW. The Arab Group expresses its condemnation and denunciation of the bombings in Damascus and the Damascus countryside and all criminal acts that threaten security and stability. The group commends the measures taken by the Syrian government to address these threats, to combat terrorism and terrorist groups, and to maintain security and stability, and stresses the importance of supporting these efforts. The Arab Group welcomes the announcement by the United States of America that it will remove the Syrian Arab Republic from the United States list of state sponsors of terrorism 47 years after its designation on the list. We consider this a positive development that supports efforts to achieve stability in Syria and the region. This would also enable political settlement that fulfills the aspirations of the Syrian people. The Arab Group strongly condemns Israeli airstrikes targeting the Abu Dhuhr military airport in northwestern Syria. These attacks constitute a serious escalation and a flagrant violation of the sovereignty, security, stability, and territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic. The group expresses grave concern about the continued targeting and damage of Syria's territory and infrastructure. These actions directly risk undermining Syria's efforts to restore security, rebuild national institutions, and address the humanitarian repercussions of years of protracted conflict. The group emphasizes that Israel's continued violation of Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity risks increasing tensions, undermining regional peace and stability, and eroding respect for international law and the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. The Arab Group calls on the international community to take a firm, clear, and principled position in the face of the ongoing aggression against Syria. We call upon the international community to take concrete steps in accordance with international law and the UN Charter to put an end to these violations and to ensure full respect for the 1974 disengagement agreement and the withdrawal of Israeli forces from the areas they have occupied in a manner that prevents further escalation and safeguards regional peace and stability. The group also affirms that the Golan is occupied Arab territory and that the imposition on the part of the Israeli occupation of its laws, jurisdiction, and administration on the Golan is null and void and without any legal effect and violates relevant UN resolutions, in particular Security Council Resolution 497 of 1981. In conclusion, the Arab Group reaffirms its support for Syria and its people in building a stable and prosperous state based on justice, equality, the rule of law, and the protection of the rights of all Syrians. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Qatar for the statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.